Now, if this sounds totally unspiritual, can I just remind you of something? I have heard so many fantastic sermons about this Holy Spirit-guided storm that brought Goliath down. Well, people seem to forget that these Middle Eastern shepherds, at the age of 7, could hit a reed at 25 meters. I mean, maybe that was important as well, that David has practiced and practiced and practiced, and he's awesome throwing this thing. Now, I don't know what it's like here, but I know in England, God bless England, I know in England in the church, somebody said recently, it is about time that the Cinderella of excellence was brought upstairs in the church, and the 2 ugly sisters of good enough and it'll do were kicked out of the church. Now, does that replace trusting the Holy Spirit? No, of course not. None of these things are mutually exclusive, but the encouragement of this series is we're going to see how God blends these 3 different things together in David's life. Greatness that was already in him that starts to come out, God's Spirit upon him that equips him, and David learning, sometimes with great difficulty, the lessons that God is teaching him. So the value of it, the encouragement of it. Let's end the last few minutes. The challenge of this mini-series. With our students at Capernwray, I have a light that I put on the pulpit. And it was given to me by the students. And when you click the little switch, you get this flashing red light. Now, they gave it me because apparently, and I think they're exaggerating, but maybe they're not. Apparently, I say a lot, 95% of Christians don't know what I'm about to tell you. And they say, Rob, that is so patronizing, man, it's not true. So rather than saying that, we'll give you this thing, and if you just flick the switch and the red light starts flashing, we'll know that you, living in Fantasy Island, think that 95% of us have never heard it before. Okay, well, the light's flashing. I just turned it on. Because I suspect many Christians don't know this. What is the climate in which God turns a boy, in all the areas that we've been looking at, turns a boy into a king? Answer: incredible enemies. David faces enemies almost every day of his life. And I've jotted down 3 enemies that we're going to keep coming across as we do this mini-series. First of all is the enemy around him. Now I'm just going to read you a few verses. This enemy is mentioned 127 times in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. I'll just read you a few verses and immediately you'll connect with this enemy. Chapter 17, verse 1, now the Philistines gathered their forces for war. Chapter 17, verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. 1 Samuel 18:17, Saul said to David, here's my older daughter, Merab. I'll give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I'll not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. The Philistines were an enemy all around David for this training period of his life. They, of course, were a group who lived along the coastal strip to the west of Israel. But very often they would attack them from the south or from the north. And David had to fight them throughout this period when he's learning stuff. And it seems to me that the Philistines picture one of the enemies that we have to fight. And that is the world out there. Its thought patterns, the way it does stuff, the way it acts, the way it impinges in our world. I think of the Philistines almost as weeds. Forgive me describing people like that, but you'll see where I'm going in a minute. You know, I hate gardening. I hate gardening with a passion. And I hate it because you work really hard and get everything sorted out, but the moment you stop working, the weeds attack and come back again. Well, the Philistines are like that. And I wonder if there are things in your life like that that keep coming in and attacking you and messing up what God is saying to you and what God is seeking to do in your life. There was an enemy all around David, an enemy mentioned 127 times. But there's another enemy in David's experience, and this enemy is mentioned 307 times by name. By far the biggest enemy David ever faced. Let me read you a few verses. I'm sure you already know this enemy. 1 Samuel 17, verse 55. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, don't get me involved in this. As surely as you live, O king, I don't know. I ain't getting involved in this. 1 Samuel 18, verse 6, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing and joyful songs and tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. 1 Samuel 18:29, Saul became still more afraid of David, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. There is an enemy all around David, but there's an enemy alongside him. In other words, somebody who is supposedly, somebody who believes in God, somebody who walks with God supposedly, somebody who's of the children of Israel. So let's translate that into the 21st century. The biggest problem for David was not the world out there. The biggest problem for David was Christians in here. Honest. That's driving the guy crazy. This guy's trying to take me out. Give him half a chance, he'll stab me in the back. The stuff going on around me, I can't believe this is the people of God. That was a nightmare for David. Now, of course, you know absolutely nothing whatsoever of that dynamic. That also is irony. Of course you know about that. Of course you know about that. The biggest kind of effect on my blood pressure, the biggest effect on me not sleeping, the biggest effect on me worrying and thinking, boy, this is uphill going, have not been the world out there. It's been Christians all around me very often. And we're going to look at how David dealt with that on some of our morning sessions or some of the principles he used. And then there's another enemy, and you know who this enemy is. Not the enemies around and the enemies alongside. But one of the biggest enemies David faced looked right back at him if he'd looked in a mirror. Stuff inside of David that he didn't understand, that kept kicking off and screwing him up and sometimes causing him to make crummy decisions. I think sometimes we put these people in the Bible on a pedestal and we are very selective in the parts of their lives that we read about. To quote Chris Christopherson from years and years and years and years and years ago, a line in a song, he's a walking contradiction, partly truth and partly fiction, taking every wrong direction on his lonely way back home. And for many of us, that's true. So I wanted to say just one thing in the last 3.5 minutes. I wanted to share with you the flashing red light principle. The principle that most Christians don't actually know. And that is that the context in which God turned a boy into a king was in the middle of all of these difficulties going on around him. And difficulties are the place where God grows us the best.